I wanted to thank the organizers for the opportunity to present today. I know the timing of this presentation is a little bit backwards because we'll have just spoken. The goal of this presentation is really to provide an overview of implementation science research methods. And obviously I'm doing this as part of the CHIMERA workshop. I've already introduced myself, so I probably won't spend a lot of time doing that right now. But it really is a pleasure to present this to you. Although I wish, I think probably as many of us, that we could be doing it in person. So I'm going to start this talk by going over some of the objectives of implementation research, and then I'll focus a little bit more in terms of the rationale for mixed methods work. While that intro will include qualitative work, I will then focus on introducing quantitative research designs, starting first with descriptive approaches and then moving on to analytic, including cross-sectional, cohorts, and modeling. And I'm just going to provide the briefest of intros to experimental methods, because the reality is that you'll be getting deep dives from really wonderful investigators on all of these methods. So the goal here is almost to provide like a landscape for this work rather than a deep dive into any of it. I want to start by saying a few things about some key themes that exist within implementation research. And I think this will probably be consistent with what you'll hear from Dr. Gang and Dr. Shelton and others. But, you know, there really is a tension between internal and external validity that, you know, within implementation research, we really do focus on external validity, on this sort of goal of generalizability. But we also appreciate that the more the real world context, the more challenging it is to control for confounders, and the more we're at risk for losing internal validity. And so that tension is really there. Within implementation research, we aim more for external validity, but we need to be cognizant of that tension that exists. You know, the evidence evaluation frameworks that exist do put a heavy focus on randomized control trials and experimental methods. But I'll note that, you know, within international health, and domestic health agencies, there really is more of a focus on broadly generalizable knowledge. So, you know, the health agencies are really interested in what is going to work best for their populace, whereas often, you know, when we evaluate evidence, we really value, you know, we really focus and value randomized control trials, which tend to be less generalizable. And so it's interesting how different frameworks you know, are built, and also how they integrate implementation data. And I think this is sort of a topic of conversation right now about, you know, can there be better evaluation frameworks that better integrate in implementation data, real world science, quasi-experimental approaches, because I think we're really coming to understand the importance of these designs. And as I'll talk about a few times today, it's really important that the sort of focus and type of evidence that you collect really emerge clearly from the sort of programmatic goals and your research priorities, the public health problems, so that you, when you think about, you know, I really want to prioritize this type of design that is going to present me with this type of data or these types of data, that is really coherent between a public health problem, you know, a set of study aims, you know, and a method that, you know, flows out of that, the types of indicators and methods and measures that you're going to collect, and how those fit into an evidence framework. So just really think about that coherence and alignment between the intervention and the strategy and the outcome measurement. So broadly, there's 6 types of designs within implementation research, and those include observational designs, where there is no randomization, where we often use cohorts and cross-sectional data. I'll talk about some of that today. Experimental designs, including randomized controlled trials, cluster randomized controlled trials, pragmatic trials, step wedge designs. I'll jump one, quasi-experimental designs, and those can include regression discontinuity, non-equivalent control groups, ITSs or interrupted time series, mixed methods designs, qualitative and quantitative data collected together, modeling, including data that are focused on microsimulations or the population level impact of interventions. And then really of all these, the only one that's really specific to implementation research that doesn't really exist outside of implementation research are hybrid designs, where we collect data in the context often of randomized control trials on both effectiveness and implementation outcomes, with either a real focus on effectiveness, like the type 1 designs, a mixed focus of strategies and effectiveness, like the type 2, or really a focus on evaluating strategies, collecting implementation outcomes with some effectiveness data, as in the type 3. But just to say that broadly, the other ones, we will include implementation indicators, we may be testing strategies, but they're not specific to implementation research. It's just that we've co-opted them to be able to evaluate implementation strategies or include implementation outcomes in the context of existing designs. So the first section is really going to focus on what are the objectives of implementation research. To frame implementation research, I think it's important to think about the research pathway. And by that, I mean, how does an idea evolve from exactly that to a program that is implemented in the most effective or optimized way possible? And that normally happens via this research pathway. And first, we normally think of the pre-interventional work, which is a lot. Those are normally, your animal trials, your phase 1 to phase 3 clinical trials, all of that work that happens before you do really have an intervention. And the idea here is really, could a program work? And those lead into these sort of efficacy studies, which are done in ideal conditions. If these are randomized control trials, they are not done in the context of normal or regular clinics. They are done in research clinics in really controlled conditions with research doctors and research nurses and research staff. But again, it's just asking in the hypothetical, could this program work with some, normally a health outcome? Effectiveness studies normally happen after that, and these start asking the program, does a program work? So in the context of real world clinics with government physicians and government nurses and other structures, could you make this program work in that setting? And once we know that that happens, and it doesn't have to be completely contiguous where one happens and then the other set of work happens, but nonetheless, that once you know that a program could work in real world settings, then you have to think about, how do I make that program work better? What are the things that I need to do in order to change that program in order to make it more effective and really achieve its potential? And that's where implementation research really comes in. And so here's the one framework, the EPIS, Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, Sustainment Framework. It doesn't have to be that. The reality is that you could use any of the implementation frameworks. I won't be talking about them, but I believe Dr. Shelton will be. But the focus there is really about exploring optimal ways of, the modifications that need to happen to a program in order to have that program really achieve its potential the way that we had imagined. And that's really happening in the real world. And it normally is sort of the final stage of this work. And while I've put this all on one graph, we think this process probably takes about 10 or 15 years. And so there's also this idea of can we make this process happen faster? Another way to think about implementation research is, that we normally have our EBIs or ESTs, our evidence-based interventions, our empirically supported treatments, and then we have our health outcomes at the end. And the stuff in the middle is normally a bit of a black box. We put an intervention in place and we measure some sort of health outcome like HIV incidence, and we're not really sure how it works. And often when it does work, we don't spend a lot of time figuring why it works. But the whole point of implementation research is to dig into that. And especially if programs are not working, is to understand what strategies did we pull off in order to make this evidence-based intervention happen? If it was a training, did we do education? So what strategies did we use? Can we measure some outcomes related to those strategies? And then down the pathway, we expect that to be associated with health outcomes. But the point of implementation research is, again, digging into the stuff in the middle to think about ways of optimizing it. So to give an example of effectiveness versus implementation-oriented research, in effectiveness research, the primary research questions are generally client-oriented, health outcomes at the individual population level. So, for example, you might study the coverage of a particular intervention and the health outcomes in question. So, you might look at your effectiveness outcome could be the number of people living with HIV that have access to ART that are virally suppressed. Within implementation research, you're really focused on the current strategies that are being used. And that could be a mix of provider or clinic or client-oriented interventions. And the focus is really on improving implementation outcomes. So you could have a study that may focus on measuring the impact of an intervention in improving the marker of implementation. And it's only really the secondary goal that's focused on assessing the relationship with client-oriented health outcomes. So what might that look like? Well, you might be implementing a blended digital and peer-based education system for ART providers, and you might be evaluating improved knowledge among providers. And then the secondary goal of that is, did they make the right choices in terms of ART, and does that then result in viral suppression? So now I will introduce some mixed methods approaches. So broadly, when you think about qualitative versus quantitative research, it's really important to think about the different goals of the work. Qualitative work is normally more exploratory, or it's really descriptive. The sample size tends to be smaller, and the methods can include in-depth interviews, observations, focus groups, really depending on what it is that you want out of that particular study. The data normally take a lot of time to collect. It's normally done in more real-world environments, although that's not always the case. The researcher is normally the instrument for gathering the data, and you really require some training in order to do qualitative data collection well. The types of questions are more open-ended and include probes. The forms of data can include words, stories, and pictures. And the types of analyses are really interpretive, focused on establishing themes or patterns. It's not intended to be generalizable, and often we hear this as a weakness of qualitative work, that it wasn't generalizable, but that's not the goal. The goal is to get deep narratives from particular folks, whether or not they represent the world. Quantitative work is very different. Quantitative work tends to be more explanatory or causal in terms of its goal. The sample sizes tend to be bigger. The methods are more structured, or can sometimes use semi-structured surveys. It's more efficient in terms of collecting data, definitely on a per-person basis. It normally is intended to test specific hypotheses, though not all of it is hypothesis-driven. The administration of it is that the researcher uses tools to gather the data. So, the person administering that tool can be peers and can be others more easily, because you just require less training to administer quantitative surveys. And increasingly they're done via digital means. The types of questions tend to be closed-ended, yes, no, Likert scales, etc. The data tends to be more numbers and statistics, and the analyses thus are statistical, focused on synthesizing, summarizing results using numbers. And here the goal really is generalizability. It's not exclusively goal, but it is often the goal of quantitative research. So why do we do qualitative research within implementation research? And we do that for sort of 5 main reasons. We do it more to explore problems. So what is an evidence-based approach to developing the question? Do you even really know what it is that you want to study? A lot of it can be done in terms of metrics development. Can you identify the variables that can later be measured? Are you measuring the right outcomes? And I think that's really important. And we do a lot of validation work to ensure that when we finally launch our 10,000 person quantitative study, that we're really, have the right questions on there. That you develop a complex and detailed understanding of a particular issue. And that formative work is really used to design an intervention. And you can describe the context or the settings surrounding an experience or a phenomenon. And you can do that using case studies of a program or a policy. You can do that using phenomenology, but that you really try to get in and understand, like, what was the context in which this intervention took place, in order for us to understand the utility of that in other settings. And again, you can explore more about sort of the why or the how of an intervention, far more so than quantitative work allows you to do. Well, what's the rationale for multiple approaches? We do them for participant enrichment. If we want these representative assessments, we can use mixed methods to optimize the sample and, and ultimately increase the number of participants. And sometimes we do that because it's primarily a qualitative study, but there are some elements of statistics that you want to learn from it. So you might end up using both approaches. I think I already mentioned this, but the instrument fidelity is really important. So ensuring that you're measuring the right things is just fundamental. And so whether you're developing qualitative tools or quantitative tools, and whether you've used the CIFAR or other frameworks to develop those, it can still be really useful to test some of those out in your local setting and make sure that they make sense. Treatment integrity is really important. Fidelity of implementation is really important. We can use a series of mixed methods approaches to try to assess the fidelity of the interventions, and again, fundamental to implementation research. And then finally, this idea of significance enhancement, or really helping you understand your data. So I think, as we do quantitative work, we sometimes see things that don't make a lot of sense to us, and qualitative work can help us explore the why of that. And so I can't really emphasize how important it is to help you interpret the quantitative things that you've seen. Okay, so now I will start really the body of the talk, which is about quantitative designs, providing first overviews, and then talking a little bit about descriptive and analytic approaches. So I'll just start by saying that there are a number of different ways that we can use cross-sectional studies and observational studies within implementation research. And when you think about those sort of over time, you can do them pre-implementation. You can get a baseline survey of prep use. You can measure the acceptability of the different implementation strategies. You can do discrete choice experiments to understand preferences. You can also do those as things are ongoing. So quantitative or qualitative work to assess acceptability of an implemented strategy, the appropriateness, the feasibility. You can do that using program logs and audits and checklists. You can do mystery shoppers. And then you can do it after the work is completed. So you can look at the impact and penetration of a strategy, the sustainability of a strategy, what were the number of clients reached, what are the percent sites that are implementing a particular strategy, has the implementation been sustained? All of that can be done with cross-sectional surveys. So broadly, when we think about these designs, you have observational designs, and the categories are broadly descriptive versus analytic. I'm not going to talk a lot today about analytic designs like quasi-experimental studies, but just to say that, and I think you'll have an entire talk on this, but this is really where the researcher does not have control over the intervention. But you do these when you think that there'll be a reasonable expectation that the intervention is going to have an effect. But there remains uncertainty about how. The RCTs often are impractical or unethical, and the intervention has the potential for replication and generalizability. And then I'll talk a little bit about modeling. And then I'll also note that the second category around experimental approaches, there's such really exciting rapid innovation in designs of these studies, as you'll hear about this week from others. So descriptive studies can be case reports, they can be case series reports, they can be surveillance studies, they can be surveys. And again, you can describe an outcome without looking for associations between variables. So you can look at the coverage of a program, and you can just see what is the markers of provision, what are the markers of uptake, what are the prevalence of different outcomes, without, again, trying to look for some sort of causal inference or looking for associations. You're just describing what you're seeing. Descriptive epi and descriptive implementation research is really important. It is often the first foray into a new area. It can prompt more rigorous studies. You can document implementation indicators, measures. You can document health of populations. It can be useful for trend analysis and planning, offering clues about the cause, and ultimately for you to make inferences about the success of a program without even really designing a study, just really looking at things descriptively. Importantly, without a comparison group, it's questionable. And is this really science and research, or are you just really evaluating a program? So, there's a fuzzy line there that often emerges as being important. So when we think about analytic studies, we can have ecological studies, cross-sectional, case-controlled cohort, they can be time series. You could have multiple baseline studies or factorial designs. And here you are often, but not always, testing a hypothesis to characterize associations between exposures, risks, possible causative factors, and outcomes. I will note, not all of these studies need to be hypothesis-driven, but nonetheless, they can be. So if we think about a cross-sectional study, the design would be looking at the prevalence of a disease, proportion of an outcome. You could compare those with the exposure into a program versus those who did not have an exposure, compare those with particular disease or health outcome to those without that disease, health outcome. I'll note that those aren't really, at that point, you're determining associations. Again, you're not really looking at like causal inference at that point, and I think risk normally implies causality. Often with these studies, there's reciprocity of an outcome, which is to say that exposure to the program, could also be exposure to the outcome relates to the program. So you don't really know which one caused which, and thus there's reciprocity. And there will be DCEs where you'll hear more about this, but I think really an important part of the armamentarium of implementation research. The goal of it is to provide a snapshot of a population at a particular point in time. Again, you're ascertaining exposure and the outcome at the same time. So it's really hard to build in temporality into these. So when we think about the advantages of a cross-sectional survey, they're easy to perform, they're inexpensive, you don't have any loss to follow because you sample everybody as you do. You can estimate the prevalence of the exposure and the outcome. Again, the disadvantages are clear, that you cannot establish causality, although we'll soon talk about some exceptions. It's really hard to sort of recreate the temporal sequence of exposures versus outcomes. But there are these new methods, including structural equation models and propensity scores, that represent these causal inference approaches that may be able to overcome some of this. So there's sort of artificial analytic approaches that are really exciting, but they still, are just analytic approaches, that you're not actually measuring the temporality of these outcomes. So a cross-sectional study, for example, on implementation research, I gave some examples earlier, but you might evaluate the baseline situation with a cross-sectional survey that could include behavioral and biological outcomes. You can implement the intervention and evaluate the effect after some time period in a second cross-sectional survey, with the recognition that participants are different, but some may be present in both samples. The advantages here is that you might even be able to get some population-level understanding of changes in the epidemic and engagement in care over time. There's lots of different cons associated with these approaches, but there can be other temporal trends and other implementation activities that are unrelated to your particular intervention or your strategy that may also be affecting outcomes in the pre-post periods. And that can make attribution of the effect really difficult. Or alternatively, the intervention may have worked, but you didn't reach enough population coverage to measure those changes in your population-based samples. So moving on to cohorts within implementation research. So, the traditional sort of active or an interval cohort includes enrollment of participants and active follow-up with those individuals. It's really expensive for anybody in the audience who's done a cohort. We know they're really expensive, but the researcher controls the timing and the nature of the measurements. Passive cohorts, including registries, electronic health record repositories, among others, are rapidly becoming a standard in implementation research, and I think we'll really hear a lot about IDEA from others this week. But there are limitations that include the quality and the extent of data collection. And so the population denominator, or the population is enumerated by the denominator, like who's in the program or who's included in the electronic health record. The researcher doesn't really control the nature or the timing of the measurement. So, if somebody doesn't come back to care, they've been lost. And so you can lose a lot of folks to follow up. But some of that, the loss to follow up, may be informative. You have a lot of missing data and a lot of misclassification of data. But again, it's really real world. And so I think that's a real advantage. When we think about the methods that are used within implementation research, the participants may have active follow-up of individuals, so that you're still in the context of a program trying to get folks to come back in. The intervention services are offered to everybody, and so the approaches, and you'll hear more about these later this week, including interrupted time series, diff and diff, or differences and differences, and regression discontinuity, tend to be used to try to measure the impact of these approaches. The pros include, that there are longitudinal behavioral and biological data collected from all participants. You can assess the uptake and retention of services. You do not have a comparison group, although you can do these nested case control studies. And there are advanced methods that you can use to try to account for selection biases between those who did and did not engage in a particular strategy. And just importantly, that there are extensive retention efforts that are needed to minimize loss to follow-up to really help you evaluate your outcome. When we think about the sort of interval-based cohorts, like internal validity tends to be very strong. Your primary outcomes of those tend to be collecting data on incidence or prevalence or relationship between exposure and outcome. In practice or in a clinic, you really need to think about how you're going to handle missing data, and you can use imputation or not. You can, if you have missing outcomes, you can use a DAG to directed acyclic graph in order to think about what an outcome may have looked like, or what a measure may have looked like that you don't have access to. And internal validity may not be as firm because there's a lot of moving pieces in terms of how your program is evolving over time, and you don't have control over a lot of that. Within implementation research, we will collect the traditional implementation outcomes, and you'll have heard a lot about those already. But just to say that, we think of these as determinants of coverage, of sustainability, of maintenance. There's also the opportunity to do modeling and microsimulations. And so, this is an example of an implementation-oriented microsimulation study. So this is a study that we have ongoing for sex workers living with HIV, where we're evaluating different strategies of treatment. So we're not evaluating the impact of treatment itself. We are evaluating different ways of delivering treatment. And the modeling includes measuring the incremental costs of different strategies or the incremental benefits of one intervention versus another. It's asking the question, who and under what health systems and structural conditions might benefit from one strategy versus another, or their combination. And then you then can ask the question, what if the strategies were scaled to address all sex workers living with HIV? We may ask the questions, what is the potential incremental impact of scaling up different strategies on HIV transmission? What does it look like in terms of infections averted among sex workers and their clients and in the broader population? So again, we're really focused on implementation questions, but we can mix in effectiveness questions in there as well. So here we're looking at this model, and we're looking at our different strategies. And in one case here, we're looking at standard of care versus decentralized treatment provision. And you can simulate this cohort, and you can have a relative hazard events, which is really about achieving viral load suppression. And then you have intervention-specific outcomes, like did you pick up your ART based on these different probabilities. And your outcomes here include durability of the intervention, as well as the proportion virally suppressed. And so that there's really two of these elements, and we can collect trial data in addition to sort of broader program data in order to do this. So importantly, this isn't about measuring treatment versus no treatment. It's about how we're delivering treatment. And then we can measure both sort of implementation as well as health outcomes related to that. So I won't focus on this too much, but just to say that, the design of these modeling studies is not so different from effectiveness studies, where you might be testing having an intervention versus not having an intervention, prep versus no prep, treatment versus no treatment. But the difference here is that you're testing strategies. So ways of delivering. Here, decentralized versus standard of care. We also have ICM on here, which is individualized case management. But again, we want to evaluate this. We want to hold these to the same standard as we would an intervention. And we want our outcomes to look at viral load suppression, on durability, on costs, on incremental impact at the individual versus the population level. And do you get additional benefits based on single intensity versus dual intensity or double intervention strategies? Now, throughout the week, you'll have a lot of discussions about experimental approaches. And so, we always ask ourselves the question, is an RCT a good way to study implementation problems? And the answer is, as you'll hear about this week, it depends. Now, again, you'll hear more about this week, but often you'll hear people say, well, randomized trials are not good for implementation science research. And I think that's not often the case. I think that, within any particular design, including randomized trials, there are times when they are great for testing out a strategy. There are times when they are great for including the measurement and implementation outcome. But I don't think it is universally the case that, we do or do not use these approaches. In fact, often we do use these approaches because we want to try to balance confounders as we would for any other intervention. And I think that ultimately, the decisions that influence this are really based on what are your questions? What is the public health problem at place? And then you can think about really making a nuanced decision about, is a trial the right design for you within sort of the broader range of designs that are available to you. But importantly, you're going to hear a lot about this during this week. And so I don't want to delve in too much other than to say that it's nuanced, it's complicated, and in that sense, I think it's interesting and I think a really exciting space right now. So when we think about, what is it that you want to know? A pragmatic trial may look at well, what does X do in the real world? And, the explanatory trials is what we traditionally think about, is what can X do under idealized settings? And, there's a lot of movement in these pragmatic trials. They don't always need to be implementation research. Pragmatic trials sometimes are very focused on effectiveness research. The question is just, what is it that you're measuring? And what is it that you're including within your pragmatic trial? Effectiveness studies are intended to understand the effect of an intervention on clinical outcomes. Implementation is to understand the effect of an intervention on implementation. So, if you educate providers, do they implement better? So you want to measure both the education as well as, ultimately, did they do their job better? Did they educate better themselves? Did they provide the right treatment? But again, the framing, as we've talked about earlier, are fundamentally different. And as a result, the questions that we're asking and the designs we're using are different. So just to finish with a few thoughts. One, I think even as we're introducing designs now, and as you'll hear about this week, there is no perfect study. So, there are going to be inaccurate measures, there are going to be challenges in generalizability, or things like bad luck, COVID-19 happens in the middle of your study. And so I don't think we need to aim for perfection as we think about these studies. But it's important to think about that, you can't fix by analysis what you bungled by design. And when you think about these really intensive statistical work that people do to try to increase comparability, if the design is fundamentally flawed, it's going to be really difficult to try to, put out really meaningful data that can help you draw inferences. And, I think as we've learned, especially over the last year, that if you publish really innovative but very biased studies, you can potentially do more harm than good. And the reference that I include here, I think, is such a great paper that discusses all of this in more detail. It was written a few years ago, so it didn't include all of the COVID-19 work, but I think would have been really relevant during this time as well. And with that, I want to thank you. I think, we'll have already had a chat, but I think you guys are really going to have a great week. So thanks.